Hello, welcome to Foundations of Communication and Leadership. This is the lecture for the book content from week one. I'm going to be posting lectures every week about the reading. I will not be lecturing on the reading in class, and I will not be lecturing to the entire book. I will just be talking about certain aspects that I think are interesting, giving some additional background that isn't in the book. So you are responsible for doing the reading. I'm going to be just bringing out some key points, additional thoughts, ideas, and background. If you see questions in the lecture, think about them because they may be asked in class. So I'm going to talk about Chapter 1, the introduction, Classical 2, classical management theories, Chapter 3, human resource theories, and a little bit of additional thoughts. Chapter 1 is mainly about making the point that the world is complex. So, how has the world become more complex in your lifetime? For me, technology has changed tremendously. Our society has changed tremendously. I was born in 1971, so the women's movement was at its height when I was born, but by the time I was in high school, Reagan was in office. The sort of tides had shifted more towards a conservative outlook. It shifted back, it shifted forth, things have changed a lot. In terms of technology, I grew up with telephones and televisions and the what was the thing that came before the VCR? The other one. We had the other one. We had home computers. We had no internet. Cell phones were not even conceived of. So I have watched enormous social, political, and technological change in my 42 years. And some of my students are 20 years older than me. Some of my students are 20 years younger. But we've all watched our world become more complex. A great deal of which is due to increased access to information and communication, which are topics we will be covering quite a bit in this class. So one way of looking at this complexity is also to think about postmodernism. So a little background, when I say modernism, I'm not talking about modern architecture or modern art or modern music. What I'm talking about is the modern era, which is considered from the Age of Enlightenment, which is somewhere around the 1600s, through around the 1950s, I think, is when postmodernism was really considered to take hold. And so the modernist perspective was that the world was understandable through science. So through the scientific method and through reducing things to their smallest components, we could understand and control our universe. Science eventually figured out that that wasn't the case, and also that scientists were never dispassionate observers, that we affect the things that we observe. Our observations are colored by our own personalities, our backgrounds, our psychology, our predispositions. And so the world became a much more complicated place when we realized that science was not the answer to everything. The book talks about globalization, terrorism, and global warming as examples of the complexity of our modern world. A nice quote, "Our new world involves complex interconnections between business, political, and cultural systems." So that's putting it mildly. Certainly the internet, more than anything, has brought the political and the cultural into our business worlds, and the corporate world into our personal world, and the political into all of our world. And so the sophistication and complexity and availability of communication and interaction has made our world much more complicated. The other thing I want to talk about is how communication is an approximation of meaning. So words are symbols, just like hieroglyphics are symbols and pictures are symbols. And these words are things that we've created to convey meaning to other people. But how the other person interprets the meaning you are attempting to convey may be different than how you mean it. And so that's something that you're going to run across a lot through the entire program as an org comm and org leadership major. But the idea of communication is to look underneath our assumption that we're all on the same page all the time. So chapter 2 talks about the machine metaphor. Organizational theorists from the early to mid 1900s wanted to mechanize production through controlling and optimizing human behavior. Okay, so why did they want to do that? Previous to the Industrial Revolution, the world, or the Western world, operated on a cottage industry economy, which meant that if my father was a shoemaker, then he would teach me to make shoes if I was a boy, but possibly if I was a girl too, because the division between the sexes wasn't nearly as distinct before the Industrial Revolution. If perhaps I was a big burly boy and I didn't have the good enough motor skills to do some really fine kind of eye-hand coordination, he might send me off to apprentice with an ironsmith. And I would learn ironsmithing then, and I would pass that on to my children. But the production of goods was controlled by families and guilds, and crafters and artisans, and there was no mass production. As technology progressed, technology began to create an environment in which products could be mass produced through mechanization. And so people were then necessary to do the steps that the machines couldn't do, but the mechanized processes could create cheaper goods that pushed the cottage industry artisans out of the market. And so suddenly the people who were farmers and shoemakers and ironsmiths didn't have a job anymore because people could get all that stuff for cheaper. So they had to move into the cities and work for factories. And in those factories, the idea was to get as much labor as possible out of the workers as cheaply as possible, so that there would be a difference between the cost of production and the price to the consumer. And so classical management theory grew out of this idea of looking at organizations as if they were a big machine, and the people were interchangeable cogs or parts that needed to be optimized, trained, controlled in order to make the machine run as efficiently and smoothly and quickly and cheaply as possible. So within the machine metaphor chapter, the author looks at three forms of authority: traditional, charismatic, and irrational, legit, or legalistic. The main thing I want to point out about this is that the traditional authority was based on caste system, kings and nobles, some kind of social hierarchy based on whether or not your family owned land and passed it down, whether or not your family had money. And so your place in the world was determined by the family that you were born into, and it was unlikely to change throughout generations, let alone your own life. Charismatic leadership is the kind of leadership we think of when we think of Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi or Hitler or a cult leader, somebody who through the force of their personality can motivate people to do a lot of stuff that they might not do otherwise. And then rational or legalistic behavior is based on a set of supposedly rational rules. Now, the thing to think about when you look at this is that certainly in the Industrial Revolution, the people who were in control of the organizations were people who were born into privilege. So the idea that the hierarchy of the organization was based on a rational, naturalistic premise is kind of false, because really the people who were managers in organizations were the people who had access to education, which means they had money, and the people who were workers were the people who did not have access to education or money. And so in many ways, the legalistic form of management really upheld traditional social forms. So within the machine metaphor, organizations were hierarchical, they were structured, and they were controlled. So that means that there was an assumption of a fundamental difference between the manager and the worker's capacity for intelligence and production. And so think about kind of what that means in other social settings. That sounds a little bit like the premise for slavery, which was that the people who were forced into slavery didn't have the capacity to function the way those who enslaved them did. A false premise, but such was also the false premise of the mechanistic metaphor. Same idea when women were assumed to not be intelligent enough to be educated or to vote. Again, the assumption that some people are born at a higher level with more intelligence, they are more human, they are more advanced than other human beings. So that same idea was encoded into the mechanistic metaphor in organizations, which continues today in many ways in organizations that run in this very hierarchical format. Certainly people have a little bit more mobility, but in many organizations there's very little mobility for people at the bottom. So something to think about: who did this system benefit, who did it exploit, and who prospered and who did not. So communication was officially top down. So the owner would tell the manager what needed to happen. The manager would determine how to make that happen and would issue commands to the workers. This certainly betrays little tolerance for ambiguity, which means that people in these organizations couldn't handle the idea that the workers might have intelligence, ideas of their own, power based on other things such as knowledge or the ability to build relationships. So when you think about a metaphor or a framework or a theory as a way of looking at how a part of the world functions, you are by necessity ignoring some data and including other data. So this is an example of that. So an interesting point regarding the intolerance for ambiguity: Taylor, the father of scientific management, was actually a highly obsessive compulsive personality. So not only was he interested in finding ways to control worker behavior as an adult, but as a child, he was obsessed with optimizing and controlling his basic bodily functions, such as how he walked and slept and ate. So he was a little bit on the OCD side, and interestingly enough, he became the father of organizational theory. And his theories are still reflected in many organizations in how they structure and train and treat employees. So how does your organization reflect mechanistic thinking? Are there some artifacts of this type of hierarchy and control in your organization, or is it predicated on different values? What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of this kind of system? So in an environment perhaps where safety is very important, something that's highly mechanized might be a really important way to control whether or not people are injured. So perhaps in a factory where there are hazardous materials. However, having that level of control in an environment where people need to innovate or to watch for flaws in the system, one would think of the Challenger disaster, having a system that's too controlled could also keep people from having the ability to surface problems if they see them. So if someone on the line sees a problem and either doesn't feel like they have the power or doesn't have the access to somebody who might be able to fix the problem before someone is injured, that can be an issue. And so what does the machine metaphor bring into focus, and what does it ignore? Well, in subsequent chapters, we're going to talk about power in organizations, power networks, and we're going to talk about human potential, and we're going to talk about organizations as systems, so as interconnected systems where hierarchy is not really a primary thing. So the machine metaphor shows us certain things and doesn't show us other things.